Hi there. Let's talk now about artists who were born in Africa and then grew up in other parts of the world and have an education in the arts, and the way in which their work really goes back to talk about their origins in Africa. Perhaps one of the most famous early artists from this is Chrisopheli, the British artist, who won the Turner Prize for painting. His celebrated and vilified painting, The Holy Virgin Mary, you see here, was exhibited in the collection of Sicari, and it was, people were deeply offended that he had created this figure of the Virgin Mary that had these cutouts of pornographic bottoms, looking like sort of flying around this figure with an obviously cartoonish black person with a large lump of elephant dung for a breast. And the whole painting is resting on two well-rounded, dried, and unsmelly pieces of elephant dung with the words Virgin and Mary. Chrisopheli, of course, is a satirical artist, and he is clearly trying to speak to the African identity with Christianity. He is himself Catholic. And you may be asking yourself, why elephant dung? Well, he had a trip back to Africa, his first since he was very young, and he was mulling around and he found some African elephant dung, and he found it kind of interesting, and he brought it back with him to Britain, and he had it lying around his studio in a bag, and he decided to use it to prop his paintings off the floor. So as he's working on his paintings, he has them sort of propped up against the floor to work on. And one day a curator came in and saw his paintings propped up on elephant dung, and he thought that was just wonderful. She was so impressed by this sort of conceptual way he was presenting his work. And so that's the way he started presenting his work, with elephant dung. And so the elephant dung has been dried. It has a texture, but for him, it's part of this kind of earthy way in which Africa enters into his work in a kind of comical fashion. He loves the sort of outrageous 1960s blaxploitation films, and the way in which the psychedelic and plays in his work as well. And so this is called space shit, and you see the sort of wild, he uses a lot of sort of silvery and gold colors to create very vibrant and exciting pieces. He also has a painting here called Aphrodisia, which again celebrating the Afro in American culture and creating again this kind of riff on psychedelic expressions and ideas. He is an artist who again has a sense of humor about what he's doing, but also a sort of very much committed to trying to explore this idea of being a diaspora African artist. Sicari Douglas Camp is a sculptor who works primarily in metal, and she, as a young girl growing up in Nigeria, remembers seeing these masquerades. And so for her, trying to find a way back to those masquerades, a tradition that was entirely dominated by men, she wants to introduce her own kind of whimsical masked figures, and not just masks that stand alone, but whole costumes that evoke the kind of presence that those masked figures had from her memory as a child. You can see here how she's also drawing from other mask traditions, the idea of the hippo masquerade, the Kalabari Alagba, and in a way it has the dramatic forms and presences, but she's using these sort of modern materials to make them more exciting and vibrant and contemporary. Here is some of Sicari Douglas Camp's more recent work, where she is doing a kind of royal portraiture, again, working with modern found materials and manipulating them in ways so that they sort of reflect on traditional materials and traditional ways in which sculptures are made in Africa. Another very famous artist is Magdalene Adondo, who again is a British artist who was fascinated in traditional African forms and ceramics. Her work sort of reflects some of the traditional pottery of Africa. It has these sort of organic, bulbous forms, but it's also very clearly sculptural. She's not trying to create a functional pot here. The way the pot is shaped by hand, this is sort of hand-built, and then it's polished, actually not using an African method, but actually a part of the Southwest American Indians, the way that they use the sawdust fired to create these highly polished and beautiful forms. There's a wonderful sense of organic rhythms in her work, poetic exploration of forms that are suggestive of bodies or costumes. It's a very unliteral interpretations of African forms, headdresses, and other features that she identifies in African dress is sort of suggested but never fully, completely articulated. In this way, her work really does have elegance and a style that is very evocative, but not specifically identified with any particular African culture or identity. Another British artist, Alatsuy, who now lives in Nigeria, in Nsukka, Nigeria, and he sort of developed this idea of gawu, which means both metal and a fashioned cloak. And he creates these sort of giant fabrics out of bits of aluminum found around the tops and sides of liquor bottles. And he kind of, using copper wire, fashions them together into ever larger pieces until he creates this huge interlocking patterns that then he hangs in a kind of cascade down from the wall, sort of evocative of the patterns and designs one might see in kente cloth, with a heavy emphasis of gold and brilliant reds and yellows and blacks. So these humble metal fragments provide a commentary on globalization. All of these bits and pieces are collected from garbage dumps. He has a large army of paid workers who go and glean these tiny bits of metal, and so that he can have them cleaned and hammered flat and pressed into the service of his extraordinary, beautiful art. Here you see another one of his shimmering wall pieces. And he does see them as walls, as part of something quite large that is both posing, both solid, but also suggests something moving, not rigid or fixed, but something that is maybe even has openings. Here we see another Alatsuy, and you get a sense of the scale of some of his larger works, which are really spectacular, with this kind of shimmering metallic feel. This was from the 52nd Venice Biennale in 2007. Here again is another one of his pieces that you'll see. You can find them in a number of different museums. I believe there's one in Chicago and in St. Louis, and I've seen them also in Kansas City. And they're really spectacular. They have this way in which they speak about this amazing amount of material that is produced and are consumed. And the way he remakes them, the way he refashions them, gives us something, this new beautiful thing that is also sort of terrifying for its scale and its incredible, vast complexity. Another artist who has really engaged this idea of material culture, recycling, reworking materials in new ways, is Yinka Shonibare, a British artist who has appeared in many different ways to use the fabrics of the Ankara cloth. We remember the Ankara cloth was these wax-resist dyed fabric in these brilliant colors. And in this case here, he's sort of using them to create these sort of height of European fashions during the Rococo, Baroque, and the Enlightenment, at a time when European colonialism was exploiting and taking advantage of African resources through this unequal trade of things such as the Ankara cloth. Here you see Yinka Shonibare. He dresses these mannequins in this absurd way, dressed in these sort of height of fashion, but now dressed in the sort of Ankara cloth. Remind us always that the wealth, the power, the prestige of Europe was built on the labor of Africa. Here is a new series by Yinka Shonibare where he creates these ever more elaborate mannequins. And again here, this is Goya's Sleep of Reasons, and a way to look at a very famous work of art. Now commentary is by sort of inserting in these sort of clothed figures who embrace the Ankara cloth designs. Here is the original design that this is based on, Sleep of Reason by Goya. One of my favorite of Yinka Shonibare's works was actually put on display in St. Louis, and it was a museum display where they had historically recreated an entire Victorian-era room. And into that room, he simply placed these mannequins of children playing, children dressed, again, in designs and costumes in the shape of period clothing, but made from the Ankara fabric. So it was a splash of color. It was exciting and exotic, but it was again a kind of reminder. But even though we're peering into the past of this area and the history of this particular area, in the design of the clothing and the layout of the materials in the room, we are always being reminded of the wealth of this period being a product of the absence of wealth in Africa. Again, this sort of tension between African culture and the modern world is wonderfully displayed in this series of photographs by Edwin Changus from Angola. Here he's dressed up people in a variety of Western clothing, but given the sort of visually intense African masks, sort of creating wonderfully poetic and humorous pictures. Aida Munale has gone further to explore this idea of photography and the African body and the objectification of women and the sense of violence and disturbing ways in which the body has been removed from contemporary art. Here you see another one of her photographs where again we are the head, the figure. There's a disturbing confusion about what's going on in this photograph. In a more painterly way, Gopal Dagnogo, Quando si leve giur, when the day rises, you see a wonderful sense of collage, an exploration of design and pattern, looking at the forms of things in the day. So Gopal now works in France, but he's originally from Côte d'Ivoire and the west coast of Africa. His unique palette of vibrant yet soft colors create his own vision of a world using invented lyrical imagery that challenges a conscience of critical reality. There's a kind of memory, recollections, and sort of confused images are layered in a way, gives you a sense of kind of flattening out. Here he's referring to migration, confusion, this idea of where do people live? How do we get from place to place? To hear a collection of a variety of contemporary African artists who are looking at Africa in quite a variety of different ways, depending on the work, the material they're using, the way in which they are addressing the history and the past of Africa, and also the way they are inserting this art into a kind of European modern context so that people in Europe are now more aware of what's going on in Africa, can see that in their work.